Hello fear seekers, and welcome back to the channel. It's not uncommon with the busy lives we lead nowadays to feel stressed, drained, and like you need a break. Sometimes there's nothing for it but to pack up some much needed essentials and escape to the wilderness for some rest, relaxation, and to reconnect with nature. Of course, that's not always what you'll find. Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, allegedly true, camping horror stories. Now, it is a dream of mine to read subscriber horror stories someday. With that in mind, I'd ask that you subscribe to the channel and like the video so we can make that happen together. If you have any scary stories from your own life, feel free to submit them to the email in the description. I would be honored to read them. Now, without further ado, sit back, ignore the sudden stillness of the forest, and get ready to ferment your fears. My life growing up was far from good. Rather than constant physical abuse, although there was that too, my parents ignored me most of the time. Both had drinking problems. My mom only worked part-time so she could, as she said, be there for her kid. But she really spent the majority of her free time in a bottle or bed. My dad was the main breadwinner, working as an over-the-road truck driver. He was away most of the time, leaving me alone to take care of myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. As long as I can remember, I was entranced by those woods. It wasn't long before I was spending my days exploring them. My love of nature only grew from there. I soon realized neither of my parents were paying attention to my comings and goings, so I began camping out in the woods overnight, here and there, just to see if I'd be missed. But, as I'd figured, I wasn't. From there, I began spending weeks at a time camping throughout the vast forest. We all know all good things must end, and one morning, I was caught walking out of the woods by my father. He'd just arrived back from time on the road. It was early, and he was livid to see his 12-year-old son walk out of the woods at 5 a.m. on a school day. In addition to a good hiding, I got an earful from them both. This didn't stop me from returning, though. After laying low around home for a week, I waited for my dad to leave and my mom to get drunk. When I was sure she was asleep, I fled back to my real home. I would slip back in early, every morning, prior to school without anyone noticing. It didn't take long for things to go back to the way they had been before. If I wasn't at school, I was roaming the woods. As I mentioned before, I had a series of camps throughout the forest. Early on, I realized I was sharing my getaway with others. Among these interlopers were small groups of homeless people. Probably way before I came along, they'd used the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the police and public. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long on one occasion, and almost got assaulted because of it. After that run-in, I moved my camps to the other side of the river. Some nights, I would lurk in the shadows and watch them destroy themselves with drugs and drink. Many times, violence would break out, and this only reinforced my hate for them. I already saw enough of that at home anyway. As the months passed, I moved deeper into the vast forest, always looking for a new place to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless. It wasn't long before they had their filthy little camps all over the woods. However, at that point, I was still safe if I stayed on my side. I was the only person who knew where to cross. River or not, my paradise would be taken from me, once and for all, by these very same people. One hot summer afternoon, I was down on the banks getting water. I'd heard voices off in the distance, so was keeping my eyes peeled. I'd retrieved my water and was returning back to my camp, when I heard a group of people arguing on the opposite side. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a raggedy tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 female yelling at one another. They were too far away for me to make out much of what was said. They all looked like they were drunk, swaying around while they argued. I stayed around for about 10 minutes when one of the men hit another over the head with a big beer bottle. The man staggered and fell to the ground. I waited for the man on the ground to move, but he didn't. The assailant then picked up a big rock and threw it down on the man while the others just stood by and watched. He did this over and over, about 3 times, until he looked too exhausted to continue. I had to stifle a scream as I watched this horror unfold, and by now was too scared to move. The female then yelled something at the man and slapped him on the chest. He looked unfazed and instead just stared down at the mess he'd just made. After a minute of doing this, the others yelled something again at him, and they all ran away together. I could finally breathe, but still dared not move, in case they returned. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours, before I decided they weren't coming back. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but now I know how stupid that was. I got the crazy idea in my head that I needed to get him help. Drunk bum or not, he was still a human. I ran the entire 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was happy to see my father was home. I ran in, short of breath, and began yelling for my parents. I noticed them sitting together on the couch and ran up to them. My dad told me to shut up and then asked what the matter was. I repeated the story of what I'd just witnessed in the woods. Rather than getting help, my dad began yelling at me about defying him. My slurring mom soon joined in, and they both commenced to chewing me a new a-hole. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up stories to get attention. I denied this, of course, but she wasn't listening. The rest went the way it always did. My dad pulled off his belt and strapped me across my behind until I began crying, and he told me to shut up or he'd give me something to cry about. It was clear to me the discussion was over. The man wasn't getting help. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I crawled off to my bedroom and cried myself to sleep, as I had done so many times before. My retreats to the woods had ended. I couldn't even leave the house without one of my folks, and going outside was out of the question. Not long after that, I was shipped off to live with my mom's dad because I'd become too much for my parents to handle. I expected life to be as much as it had before, maybe even worse. After all, there had to be a reason why my mother was so messed up. I kept my guard up for a long time, waiting for the first beating to come. Instead, I would be given a life I could have never dreamed of. Grandpa Mac turned out to be a loving and patient man, the exact opposite of any adult I'd ever met before. The first time he asked me what I liked to do, I was speechless. No one had ever cared to ask. I swallowed the knot in my throat and told him of my love for nature. Expecting the usual laughing and mockery, I braced myself, but instead his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me of all the great memories he had of camping with his father. I knew then I had become the luckiest kid in the world. As soon as the spring came, we spent every waking moment hiking the woods and parks throughout the country. The knowledge he passed on to me could fill a library full of books. Even though he's gotten too old for us to go out together, I still visit him on a regular basis and share all the amazing adventures I have been through recently. His body may be weak, but his mind is still as strong as ever. I owe that man more than I'll ever be able to repay, and he did everything just because he loved me. It still took me a good 3 or 4 years until I summoned up the courage to tell him the story. Also, I expressed the guilt I felt for keeping it to myself all this time. I was unsure of how he'd react. At first, he sat quietly. A moment or two later, he sat up in his chair and hugged me tightly. This confused me, and when he let me go, I asked him what I should do. His advice to me was to contact the police back home and share the story with them. After that, the responsibility was out of my hands and I didn't need to be guilty ever again. Once I contacted them, I washed my hands of the guilt. Now that I've grown up, I realize my parents were at fault. I did what I should have. If they chose to say nothing, it was on them. I went off to college, and upon return at Christmas, Mac let me know that the people responsible had been found, although all but the woman were dead. She shared the location of the man's body with detectives. They wanted to thank me for coming forward and helping them to solve the case after all these years. With that, I moved on, leaving that terrible part of my life behind me. Until recently, with the death of my father, which seems to have dredged up all these old memories, I had not thought of that part of my life in some time. My love for the woods and its creatures has grown into my livelihood. Now, I get to travel all over, discovering and preserving the world's wild places before they are gone. Something I could have only dreamed of as a kid, trapped inside a rundown apartment in New Jersey. And without Mac's love, understanding, and teaching, none of it would have ever happened. This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been camping since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m. and we drove the 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing one a little closer, but he swore I'd love it when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half wasn't that bad. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but we're back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again and not paying attention to where I was going. We arrived at a flat section and I was relieved. My friend was in front and somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. All I remember was that one second I was clomping along and hitting the ground the next. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I stood up, my right leg buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharpened stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there were several more stakes in the bottom of the hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bone sticking out of my shin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I was already. I looked up to get an idea of where I was and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend, only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at that moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped, and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug some type of bear trap and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me with a tree limb. This worked, at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious. I wasn't getting out of the hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't very concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above me and freaking out. So I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to get help. The ranger station was only a little over an hour back from where we came. He could easily get help and make it back to me with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy me. By now, it was coming in waves and the accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed the wise decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while. That is, until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps. I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay, until I began to notice the hole filling with water. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared underwater. After an hour, the storm began letting up and I could relax. The water level was only about halfway up my shins, and I knew now, if it continued at that rate, help would be here before it even reached my waist. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. The only positive about the whole thing was it had taken my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest in my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time the ropes pulled me out, the water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in a little hole, out in the middle of nowhere, still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital went by fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive, broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I may give my friend a ring. We haven't seen one another in a few years, and a camping trip may be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. The argument always started the same way, every time. "You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I like it that way." Old school was a kind description of how he camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it newfangled junk. My mother tried on multiple occasions to introduce things, as common now as nylon tents, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather carry that big, musty wall tent everywhere we camped, and don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked all over everything. He was certainly a man born too late. The term roughing it had to have been coined with him in mind. We'd continue to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would drag us out to the National Forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for the time of year, and the forest was beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with the hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing Dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight, me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it may be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let two young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the two of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, and then go back out until supper. We've been doing this as long as I can remember, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflage clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had been just a few days before, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them at the time. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a whistling going by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer came, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called to Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to trick me or was in real trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle and listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction, about 20 yards, and stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike. I knew it had to be Mike. I ran to the bush he was laying under. The sight I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already was. Had I been older, I may have known better how to move him, but I just reached down and scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow, I held myself together and ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my father. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me, and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed toward where I'd set him down, and he took off. By the time I'd caught up, Dad was already picking him up and heading for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, Mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More than shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctor gave us the news. Things had been touch and go for a long time. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now that the urgency of the situation had passed, I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my dad considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mom, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as late as the day Mike was discharged, no names had been connected to the case. The most widely held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the lack of red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this happened, and, sadly, won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate ones. 34 years have passed since then, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery and went on to start his own business and family just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of this mess. We never returned to the national forest, and even better, Dad decided with all those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Between 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This was the way I'd always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck nor Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors has never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer, perhaps the most important of all goods. We'd loaded up and were ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we had no idea what lay ahead of us, and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how dry the surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, wasn't my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn put the knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos to use, setting up the tent. I had purposely got the easiest tent I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd become obnoxious and loud when we got drunk. More importantly, I like to make big bonfires and turn up my music loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. Despite the hangover, I resolved then and there it was something we were going to do much more often. When I finally dragged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. This made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed an armful of wood. When I returned, I set it down on the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then, I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open, and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything we could keep, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after, we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire. It would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we left for home. Most of the night, the 3 of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 in the morning, we decided to turn in, the beer having long since been drunk. My last memory was Chuck going out to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his bag, but eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to urinate like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other two up. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell, similar to burned meat, hit me. I figured one or both of the guys were already up and burning our breakfast. I looked behind me and saw only Glenn, who was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark for him. I looked up expecting to see my brother burning food, but was met with a sight far more serious and horrible than I would have ever imagined. The fire was burned out, and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up, within a few steps, and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then, all of a sudden, it hit me what I was seeing. Chuck was lying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was black and smelled the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he didn't answer immediately, I ran into the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but when I yelled, "Chuck's effing dead!" loudly in his face, he jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point toward the remnants of the fire and the horrible vision that the sun was making clearer by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him, silently with my eyes closed. Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrid smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when I first realized I had urinated myself. It didn't matter, though. With every second, the sight became clearer, and I was too terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what had happened. They arrived about a half an hour later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned up the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to one of the officers. The smell was still so bad, I began retching and retreated, back to the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent. We talked about the trip and the events of the night before, nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later with the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from the terrible smell of my brother's burning flesh. Looking back on it now, I acknowledge I may have looked a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of the family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate to another how to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling my mom was as bad as I imagined. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when Mom found them. Boys their age are usually hard to adopt out, but Mom had fallen in love with them at first sight. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of the family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was on her. This was the first instance I began to get the feeling Glenn harbored suspicions toward me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his usual questioning look, many times throughout that month. As the months passed, more and more questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention here. I had always assumed Chuck had passed out or tripped and fell into the fire, which had ultimately killed him. He had been much drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance. Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured. A worrying sign for sure, but even the doctor was forced to admit things like this happen in a fire. The skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason, they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I try to show him that this is the wrong time to be apart, he's convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations toward Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. More than once I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. Do I have my own suspicions? Yes, but now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us more than ever right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break her heart, it may just kill her. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for our mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers and if it led to Chuck's death. Even if it yields some terrible truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother too. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you or someone you know ever had an unexpected encounter while camping? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, if you have any scary stories that you want to be told, be sure to send them in. Okay guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.